STEM representation is often framed as what a scientist looks like. But if you can't see the scientist, how do you convey representation in a way that enables someone to say, "Hey, that's me"? Hi, I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Marshall. Welcome to Tumble, the show where we explore stories of science discovery.
Today This is how me and my co-host Marshall begin every episode of Tumble, the science podcast for kids we've been producing since 2015. Tumble's a show about the process of science, told through scientists' stories of discovery. It's rooted in the belief that if kids understand how science works, the world will be a better place. That's why Tumble takes the approach of connecting kids' curiosity to scientists' experience of how science works. And it's why when kids send us science questions, we ask what they think the answer is and how scientists would find out. Here's an example.
My name is Anaya. I'm 7 years old. My question is, why does the eclipse happen? I think the eclipse happens just because of the timing of how the moon is moving. I think scientists can find out by studying what the cycle of the moon rotation and the earth rotation is.
From the beginning, we wanted to show that scientists come from diverse backgrounds, just like our listeners. And that diversity is really important to scientific progress. We've done over 150 episodes now, and finding diverse scientists isn't hard. The bigger challenge is figuring out how to communicate diversity through audio. If our listeners couldn't see the scientists they were hearing from, how would they know that they might look like them? We got the chance to figure it out when we received a National Science Foundation grant to study how science podcasts can be used to engage blind and low vision students in STEM. There's a long story around how this grant came about, but the relevant part for this story is that we were given funding for episodes featuring scientists who happen to be blind or low vision. Then, researchers would study those episodes for how they could be used in the classroom to shift attitudes for students and teachers around who could do science. We'd begun our own story of science discovery. The episodes we created in these series have become some of our favorite Tumble episodes ever. We started with 3 objectives. First, stories would not be about overcoming blindness as a narrative. Second, the series would be similar to the types of stories we already tell, using formats that are already successful for our podcast. Third, we'll follow scientists' lead on how they wanted to identify themselves. We worked with an editorial advisor named Dr. Peter Walters, who is himself a blind physicist, and Andrew Leland, a writer whose excellent memoir, Country of the Blind, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize this year. Their biggest piece of advice was to not put my own words around scientists' blindness. This advice is echoed in the Disability Language Style Guide produced by the National Center on Disability and Journalism at Arizona State. It reads, "When possible, ask sources how they would like to be described." With this in mind, I got ready for my first interview with Dr. Amy Bauer, an oceanographer. We were halfway through the conversation before I teed up my question. You also do a lot of work with sonification and also translating this ocean data into sound. Can you tell me a little bit about that and why it's important to you?
Yeah, so I'm doing some exploration of how we can use sound to quote unquote visualize data. I'm a blind scientist, so in fact, the data that I'm collecting and measuring is now pretty difficult for me to see on a graph.
The approach had worked. Here's how it came together in the episode after we describe how Amy uses sound to collect data. So usually scientists turn the numbers from their data into visual forms, like charts and graphs, but that doesn't really work for Amy.
I'm a blind scientist, so in fact, the data that I'm collecting and measuring is now pretty difficult for me to see on a graph.
Amy became blind while she was training to become an oceanographer. So that led her to experiment with something called data sonification.
Data sonification, it's a big word, is basically just translating numbers into sound.
This section didn't come until about halfway into the episode. We realized that audio had an advantage for our listeners and for our storytelling. We could present Amy as a person before we presented her disability, giving listeners the opportunity to listen to her as a scientist before hearing her as a blind scientist. I took the same approach in the other interviews and got a slightly different type of response in each one. The environmental scientist Trevor Attenberg described how he became blind.
I was born with the condition that would cause me to lose my vision. I lost most of my vision pretty early on in my life. It was actually a facial deformity that caused it, something that affected the way my bones in my face grew. That damaged my optic nerves.
Dr. Mona Minkara, a molecular biologist who's a well-known disability advocate, told me she studies tiny molecules because they are too small for anyone to see.
When I learned that, I wanted to learn more about what they did. And because nobody can really see them, and I'm blind, I felt like, we're all on equal footing.
I was feeling pretty confident about how this was going until we did an episode that started with a listener's question. The question was, how did humans create language? I interviewed Dr. Robert Engelbretson, a linguist who is blind. He never mentioned his blindness in describing his story or his research. So I tentatively asked this question. Do you have any advice for children who might be listening who are blind or low vision, who might be thinking about pursuing a career in science or specifically linguistics even?
Let me think about how I want to answer this. I find part of that question to be problematic because I don't think being blind or being sighted or being any number of identities really has an effect on my career choice to be a linguist. And I think if you have to quote me on this, and maybe you don't, but I think what I would want any child to know is to not let other people's beliefs about you and what you can or cannot achieve for whatever reason, to not let that define what you choose to do with your life. But I don't think my happening to be a blind person really had much of an influence on also being a linguist. I think those are kind of independent.
Listening to Robert, he couldn't have been more clear that he didn't want his blindness to be part of his narrative. Outside of his work on accessibility in linguistics, he didn't see his identity overlapping with his science. Our editorial team and advisors went back and forth about whether we should try to mention his work on accessibility in linguistics, but it didn't serve the story about language's origins. Ultimately, we decided to mention that Robert happened to be blind and also an expert on Braille. Then we moved on, letting Robert serve as our guide as we traveled back in time to explore the origins of language. I'll be honest, this episode was the most challenging one to write. We went through many drafts, and not just because there's no real answer to how language began, although that was part of it, but it's the episode that I learned the most from. It helped me see that there's a spectrum when it comes to representation in STEM. Not every scientist leads with their identity. In fact, everyone I spoke with led with their science. I listened to how they were telling their stories and constructing their narratives. And even if they showed up as advocates for inclusion outside of their labs, they wanted to be seen as scientists first. And audio allowed them to do that. In audio, people can use their voices to choose how they represent themselves. They may not want to put themselves in the boxes that the visual world has forced them into their entire lives. Audio storytelling offers that freedom. Where I had seen the lack of visual representation as a problem to solve, it was actually, get this, a strength. I had the opportunity to represent scientists in the way that they wanted to be seen. I had always followed the principle of being authentic to scientists' stories, and sharing their identities was no different. But back to the goal of the grant. How does that kind of storytelling translate to classrooms where our goal is to shift attitudes about who can do science? So far, we've gotten evaluations from teachers on our first episode, the one with Amy Bauer. The researchers we're working with wrote this in their report. Quote, "Teachers appreciated that the focus was on how Amy Bauer did the science and did not focus on her blindness, i.e., inclusive messages were embedded." I felt pretty good about that feedback. I think it shows that we check the boxes of our 3 objectives. The stories aren't focused on overcoming blindness. The episodes in general are interesting. And we were authentic to the scientist stories by following their lead. That's why inclusivity felt embedded in the episode. We didn't have to emphasize a scientist's blindness to convey that message. Here's how Amy puts it.
Because science works best when we have a diverse community of scientists.
It turns out doing a podcast series on blind scientists brings you to a much more inclusive understanding of representation in STEM. Diversity is not just about who you see in science. It's about how scientists see themselves and how we relate to them. Stories draw the connection for kids to see themselves in science. And audio is an amazing way to tell those stories.